my encounters with the opium trade were really completely accidental. Before I wrote Sea of Poppies, I had very little, I knew very little about the opium trade. As indeed, I think most Indians, even historically well-informed Indians, know very little about it. And, I studied history as an undergraduate. Most of the major historians of India, of my generation at least, are friends of mine, So I knew their conversations, I knew what they were writing. But opium never figured in it, I mean, that's one of the most extraordinary things about the opium trade. This incredibly important commerce, which really, made, as it were, the continuation of the British Raj possible in India, which had such profound consequences for China.
The creation of Hong Kong, for example.
The creation of Hong Kong, Bombay, Singapore, Shanghai, 4 of the most important cities in today's world.
How many people here knew that?
I mean, it's just an extraordinary thing. I mean, the modern world is really unimaginable without this trade. And yet, so little is said about it, so little is written about it, really, So, I started writing Sea of Poppies as a book about migration, about people who were leaving India, And that was how I came to this, because, the first and the most astonishing thing about the first groups of people who leave India, as you know, I mean, India and China are such enormous diasporas today, without which we wouldn't have this workshop. But Indians and Chinese, like most Asian peoples, except perhaps the Malays, were not great travelers. Before the 18th century, there is no diaspora. It's not like the Western diasporas, which started so early, really, with the Greeks and the Romans, and the Arab diaspora started so early. But Chinese and Indians and so on were very homebound people. They never left, So it starts in the 18th century, really, and then into the 19th. But the earliest years of the indentured migration out of India was the mid-1830s, soon after the banning of the slave trade, when Indians became the replacement labor. So I started looking at this, and the thing that amazed me was that, of course, we all know it, but sometimes you know something without, as it were, really realizing it, The earliest Indian migrants were all from the deep interior of India, from the deep heartland, from this area between Patna and Benares, the Bhojpuri-speaking region. And, when you look at that and when you consider that as a fact, it's a very peculiar thing, because usually migrants are from coastal areas. And these people were really from the most settled heartland of India. Why were they leaving? And they were terrified of the sea. They called the sea the Kala Pani, They had no experience of the sea. So, that just got me thinking, and I started thinking about what was in the background, And of course, there were many things in the background, as there always is in history. There were wars and, famine and so on. But also, this was exactly the area where the British expanded the cultivation of opium very dramatically between the late 18th and early 19th centuries. So, that was how I got interested in it.
Did you try any opium in preparation?
Everyone asks me that. And, I'll tell you this. We all try opium all the time. If you ever take a cough syrup, it's basically opium. If you take any painkillers, codeine is opium. If you have, I'm sure everybody here has taken Imodium at some point. Imodium is opium. Really, if you've ever had an operation and had anesthesia, it's almost certainly an opiate. And the use of opiates, in fact, in prescription drugs is increasing at a fantastic rate. I mean, so many of these, the Xanax and Zoloft and all of those things are essentially just recycled opium. So that's one answer to it. The other part is that, there's a peculiar sort of thing in Asia. There's a long line going through Asia, which I hadn't realized. This line sort of bisects eastern Bangladesh, On the eastern side of this line, people smoked opium. On the western side of this line, people ate opium. So to smoke opium, you needed a particular sort of, you needed a particular grade of opium, a grade of opium refinement. And even then it had to be refined. And then you needed a particular kind of pipe, which you can now buy, as souvenirs in shops in China. But to get opium of that grade is almost impossible. Someone wrote a book really called, something about hunting for the last opium den. Huh. And this was in the 80s or 90s, and he found one opium den in Cambodia. And I'm sure that's disappeared as well.
So I guess the next time you have a flu and you have a cough drop, you should imagine yourself as a Thomas de Quincey style, romantic. I was, more seriously, I was very impressed in that. It seemed like a great portrait of migration and in coolieism. And there's a kind of really thrilling scene in the first few pages of the first book where the main character, Zachary Reed, who's a mixed race freedman from Baltimore, this is just, the same century as the Civil War, travels to India and meets with one of the British colonials there who essentially says, I'm glad you're here. Since we don't have slaves anymore, we have no more labor. Like, run out and get us some coolies right now. And watch out, because some slaves are gonna, pickpocket you on the way out. So I thought there are all these, really interesting ironies about migration and about,
Well, I spent a lot of time in the archives in Mauritius looking into this stuff, at their papers and things, and I came across a letter written, all of you know Leclésio, who won the Nobel Prize for Literature some years ago. He has Mauritian roots, and I came across a letter written by his ancestor saying exactly this. It was sent to the governor in Bengal, saying, "Please send me some coolies.
Wow.
My slaves are all gone." I wonder if Leclésio even knows that this letter exists.
On that point about research, I don't know if you can tell, but all the books have a 4-page section in the back about all the acknowledgments, and I was wondering if you could maybe even just read a sentence of the acknowledgments, just so the audience has a sense of the kind of archives you've been digging in.
Okay. I can't imagine it's the most interesting part of apart from these journals, this book follows Neil's Khabardari in hewing closely to the Canton Repository and the Canton Register, which was edited in this period by John Slade. Apart from these journals, it relies principally on books, memoirs, documents, travelogues, and word lists that were written and compiled by people who lived in or visited Canton at around the same time as Neil. David Abeel, Elijah C. Bridgman, Colin Campbell, C. Toogood Downing, Captain Robert Elliott, Emile Defoe, Shen Fu, Thomas Gardiner, Charles Gutzlaff, William C. Hunter, J. Johnson, William Kershaw, and so on and so on. Harriet Lowe, William Henry Lowe, and several other members of this well-traveled Brooklyn family. We are actually sitting, where we are sitting was one of the nodes of the opium trade, in the sense that many of the most important opium traders were actually from Brooklyn.
Wow. And Amitav cites a number of books with titles like A Collection of Authentic Chinese State Papers Illustrative of the History of the Present Position of Affairs in China, edited J. Louis Schuck, Macau, 1840. So there are these kind of documents you didn't know exist. And I learned so much, about, for example, the Chinese dish known as samosas from Xinjiang province. But can you tell me about what that process was like in terms of researching?
It was very, very interesting, actually. It was really, I enjoy the research part, knowing that in some sense it's not the most essential part of a novel. In fact, it's as it were almost the easy part. It's the break, that you get from staring at a sheet of white paper. So I went to a lot of archives, I went to a lot of museums, I dug around and dug around and dug around, and it was a lot of fun to do, actually. All sorts of extraordinary stuff kept arriving in my hands, because, when you're sort of digging with a sort of specific focus, stuff does come out, you find things.
So River of Smoke takes place primarily in Canton in China, at the right when the Chinese government is starting to ban opium. And I was wondering, how difficult was it to research the Chinese side of the story? I mean, are a lot of these things translated? I mean, I saw like there's the Arthur Whaley book, and I mean, was that a different process than the rest of it?
Well, you know, for the Chinese side, it was very, very difficult because, of course, I don't know Chinese. I mean, I started learning.
Me neither.
I started learning Cantonese, and you know, I sort of persisted with it. So I could at least understand some spoken Cantonese, and even when it's represented in Roman script, I can understand some of it, understand some ideograms and so on. But certainly not at a level where I could, you know, do any research with the Chinese papers. But I didn't really need to either, because you know what really interested me was the Indian location in this war.
Yeah.
You know, because that is what is sort of completely effaced and occluded and obscured. You know, that's what I really wanted to know about, and that was sort of like virgin territory, really. You know, and well, it was very exciting to do because, you know, for the Chinese side, what I mainly relied on were edicts, proclamations, a lot of memoir. There were a certain number of memoirs. Then Lin Sezhu, you know, who was the main actor on the Chinese side, his journals are translated by Arthur Whaley and so on. But most of all, I felt that Lin Sezhu was of course a great literatus, you know, and he was a great literary stylist, and he left, his letters were unbelievable, his edicts even were written in this sort of register of language that no longer exists, you know. I mean, governments nowadays sort of communicate in such mealy-mouthed ways, you know. But in those days, I mean, the way that the government spoke was so thunderous and so spectacular. And you know, years ago, I read a book which had a very profound influence on me. It was Gamal al-Ghitani's book, Zaini Barakat. It's a novel about 18th century Egypt, you know. But he makes wonderful use of edicts and proclamations and so on. And I saw there the possibilities that that existed there. So it was very exciting to actually recreate the conditions of a sort of Chinese voice speaking directly, you know, to the reader, as it were.